there's one country in South America that breaks the mould. It's neither Spanish nor Portuguese speaking. In fact, it's the continent's only English-speaking nation, with a culture as vibrant and diverse as a rainbow. That's right. Today we're diving into Guyana, uncovering its rich history, stunning geography, complex politics, and booming economy. Alright, so the first people here were indigenous groups like the Arawak, Carib, and Warao. They knew the rivers like the backs of their hands, carving dugout canoes to travel them, and growing cassava and other crops with slash-and-burn farming. And as you can imagine, hunting and fishing are what kept their communities thriving for centuries. But that all changed in 1498, when Christopher Columbus spotted the coastline. After that, Spain quickly claimed the territory, although it didn't exactly rush to settle it. Which makes you wonder why, right? Well, it's simple. The dense rainforests, lack of gold, and fierce resistance from the Carib people kept them away. For a while, this stretch of South America was even nicknamed the Wild Coast. The Dutch, however, saw potential. So, in the early 1600s, they built trading posts, and by the mid-1600s, were running plantations for sugar, coffee, and cotton, which the enslaved Africans were forced to work on. On top of that, the Dutch also engineered an impressive canal system to control flooding and transport goods. Fun fact, some of those waterways are still in use today. By the late 1700s, that's when the British entered the picture. Because after years of skirmishes, treaties, and political deals, the Dutch handed over control in 1814, and the British merged their new territories into what they called British Guyana. Under British rule, the sugar industry exploded. But when Britain abolished the slave trade in 1807, and then slavery itself in 1834, tens of thousands of freed Africans left the plantations to form their own villages. Now, plantation owners were desperate for cheap labour. So, as a solution, they turned to indentured workers from India, along with smaller numbers from China and Portugal. In fact, thousands of them arrived between 1838 and 1917, but under strict contracts. Many stayed after their contracts ended, bringing their food, traditions and religion with them. And by the early 20th century, Guyana had become a diverse mix of Afro-Guyanese, Indo-Guyanese, indigenous peoples, Europeans and Chinese. For a moment it would seem like they would live in harmony, but underneath the surface, tensions brewed. At the time, Guyana's economy depended on just a few crops, political rights were limited, and deep divisions ran between ethnic groups. And by the mid-1900s, calls for independence were getting louder. So in 1950, the People's Progressive Party, or PPP for short, was formed by Cheddi Jagan and Forbes Burnham, bringing together Afro and Indo-Guyanese, at least at first. Then, in 1953, the PPP won elections, but Britain, worried about their leftist leanings during the Cold War, suspended the constitution and sent in troops. When democracy returned in 1957, the PPP had already split into two parties. Jagan's PPP, mainly backed by Indo-Guyanese, and Burnham's People's National Congress, also known as PNC, supported mostly by Afro-Guyanese. Despite all the political turmoil, Guyana finally gained independence on May 26, 1966, with Burnham as Prime Minister. But unfortunately, independence didn't bring instant stability. Politics stayed closely tied to ethnicity, and Burnham's socialist policies in the 1970s led to economic decline. And in 1978, the country shocked the world with the Jonestown mass suicide, where more than 900 people died under the direction of American cult leader Jim Jones. But that wasn't all. By the 1980s, Guyana faced serious challenges, including food shortages, high unemployment, and a wave of emigration. Burnham died in 1985, and Desmond Hoyt took over, gradually pushing the country toward economic reforms. However, the real political shift came only in 1992, when Guyana held its first free and fair elections in decades, bringing Cheddi Jagan back as president. But as we all know, a country's history is just one piece of the puzzle. If you truly want to go in depth, we have to look into something more macroscopic. It's geography. Guyana is tucked right along the northern coast, with the Atlantic Ocean lapping at its shores. To the east is Suriname, to the south and southwest is Brazil, and to the west is Venezuela. Now let's zoom in. Along the coastline, there's a skinny strip of land, just 10 miles or 16 kilometers at its widest. that actually sits about 5.5 feet or 1.7 meters below sea level at high tide. Yeah, you heard that right. Below sea level. That's why Guyanese engineers have spent centuries building about 140 miles or 225 kilometers of seawalls and earthen dikes, plus a whole network of canals with sluice gates to keep the ocean from flooding towns and farms. Move about 40 miles or 65 kilometers inland, and the land starts to ripple, low sandy hills on one side, and rising up to about 400 feet or 120 meters on the other. This is the White Sands region, named for the pale sand covering much of the ground. Underneath you'll find a low plateau, sprinkled with ancient volcanic intrusions that create the countless rapids you'll see on Guyana's rivers. And then the highlands. If you head deeper into the country, you hit the Opentiera Plateau, generally under 1,600 feet, or 490 meters above sea level. This is where you find one of Guyana's showstoppers, Opentiera Falls, a single sheet of water plunging 741 feet, or 226 meters straight down. That's almost 5 times taller than Niagara Falls. Push further south and you reach the wide-open Rupununi savanna, split in half by the Canuku Mountains. Down at the border with Brazil, you'll find the Acari Mountains, which climb to about 2,000 feet, or 600 meters. And in the far west, Mount Roraima, a flat-topped giant that soars to 9,094 feet, or 2,772 meters. And if you're wondering about the climate, picture a warm, humid, and consistent atmosphere. I'm talking mid-70s to mid-80s degrees Fahrenheit, or about mid-20s degrees Celsius almost every day in Georgetown. But it's not all hot, because there are 2 rainy seasons on the coast, a long one from April to August and a short one from December to early February. But the southern savannas only get the long one. Okay, so beyond the beautiful landscape, there is one thing that's causing a lot of tension in Guyana right now, and that's politics. First off, Guyana has a big border dispute with Venezuela over a huge chunk of land called the Essequibo region, which is packed with valuable natural resources. Now, this dispute isn't new. It dates back to the 1800s, when colonial powers argued over who owned what. But things stayed pretty quiet for a while, until oil was discovered offshore in 2015. Suddenly the stakes got way higher. Fast forward to December 2023, and Venezuela's leader, Nicolas Maduro, held a referendum claiming that most Venezuelans want to annex that disputed territory. He even threatened to use military force, which sent alarm bells ringing across the region. Needless to say, the Guyanese president, Mohamed Irfan Ali, wasn't thrilled. Thankfully, after tense talks, both sides agreed to avoid fighting. So what kind of government does Guyana have to handle all this drama? It's a hybrid system, kind of a mix between a republic and a parliamentary setup. They have a 65-member National Assembly, and the party or coalition that wins the most votes gets to put forward the president. That president then picks a prime minister and cabinet. Right now, President Mohamed Irfan Ali of the People's Progressive Party Civic, or PPPC, is at the helm. He won the March 2020 election after a months-long recount and legal challenges. Now, I won't go into much detail about the intricacies of their government, but here's an interesting fact. Guyanese politics often falls along ethnic lines rather than strict political ideologies. So the PPPC generally has support from Indo-Guyanese communities, while the main opposition coalition, led by the People's National Congress Reform, or PNCR, draws mainly from Afro-Guyanese voters. There's also a smaller multiracial party called the Alliance for Change. This ethnic divide means politics can get pretty tense, especially leading up to elections, and experts warn that it could make things tricky again in 2025. But on the bright side, Guyana's economy has continued to grow despite political tensions, and it's all thanks to oil. Traditionally, Guyana relied on farming, like rice and sugar, and mining minerals such as gold and bauxite. But since that big offshore oil discovery, everything changed. Imagine this. The US Geological Survey says Guyana has about 13.6 billion barrels of oil reserves, plus 32 trillion cubic feet of natural gas. ExxonMobil and its partners have been exploring since 2008 and have made dozens of big finds in the Stabroek Block, about 120 miles or 190 kilometers offshore. Not only that, oil production also kicked off in 2019, and by 2030, they expect to pump over 1.7 million barrels a day. That's a huge amount, especially for a country with just under 1 million people. Because of this oil boom, Guyana's economy went from struggling to thriving, even during the COVID-19 pandemic. In fact, the IMF reported that in 2020, Guyana's economy grew nearly 44%, while most of the world was shrinking. Then, between 2021 and 2024, the average growth was about 40% annually, and it's expected to keep growing strongly into 2025. So, to manage all this new oil wealth, Guyana created the Natural Resource Fund, a sovereign wealth fund designed to save and responsibly use oil revenues. Since 2019, this fund has helped pay for infrastructure like roads and power, as well as social programs in health and education. And by 2025, the government plans to withdraw almost $2.5 billion from this fund to fuel national development projects. Now, while the oil boom is a game changer, it also adds fuel to the fire of the territorial dispute with Venezuela. The country's government auctioned off 8 new oil blocks in 2023, which Venezuela called illegal. So tensions remain high, and while most expect these won't explode into full conflict, investors are watching closely. Speaking of investments, Guyana's growing oil industry has deepened ties with countries like the United States and the United Kingdom. Both nations have significant economic interests there and have even warned Venezuela against military action. The US, for example, has increased trade with Guyana, importing billions in goods, even as some tariff issues have popped up in recent years. The US also helps out through foreign aid. Around $3.3 million in 2023 went toward health, education, security, and environmental programs. Plus, they've supported Guyana's fight against drug trafficking and improved local security with patrol boats and training. So, what's next for Guyana? Well, the country stands at a crossroads between an oil-fueled economic boom, a fragile political landscape marked by ethnic divisions, and a high-stakes border dispute. The next big test will be the national elections scheduled for late 2025. And of course, the International Court of Justice's ruling on the border dispute, expected in 2026. For now, Guyana is navigating its newfound wealth carefully, hoping to turn its natural riches into lasting prosperity for all its people. Which brings us to the next topic, culture. Much like many South American nations, family is central to daily life in Guyana, but it looks a little different depending on background. For instance, Afro-Guyanese families tend to be matriarchal, while Indo-Guyanese families usually follow a patriarchal tradition. Despite these differences, everyday dress and social customs blend smoothly across groups. And of course, this diversity extends to food. Guyana's cuisine is a fiery fusion of South Asian, South American, and Chinese flavours, all amplified by fresh tropical fruits and hot local chilies. One standout dish is pepper pot, a thick, spicy stew made with beef, pork, or mutton, potatoes, and peppers, slow-cooked in cassaripe, which is a sauce made from cassava juice and spices. It's so spicy, locals recommend keeping a cold beer or some locally distilled rum nearby to cool down. And if you think the vibrance ends there, think again, because the art scene is just as colourful. Indigenous Arawak and Carib crafts like textiles, intricate baskets and paintings are popular both locally and abroad. But more than that, Guyanese literature is also incredible, with writers like Wilson Harris and Walter Rodney making waves internationally. One of the most famous is E.R. Braithwaite, author of To Sir, with Love. It's a novel about a Guyanese teacher navigating a tough London school, later made into a movie starring Sidney Poitier. So, if you haven't watched it yet, I highly recommend it. And if you want to further deep dive into the country's culture, be sure to visit Georgetown, the capital of Guyana. There, you'll come across cultural institutions such as the Guyana Museum, Walter Roth Museum of Anthropology, and the Guyanese Heritage Museum offer an in-depth look into the country's history and indigenous cultures. There really is so much to unpack about Guyana, and we're only just scratching the surface. So, if you could choose which topics to explore further, would you want to learn more about its wild landscapes, its diverse yet rich culture, or the unfolding political drama? Let me know in the comments section below. And as always, if you enjoyed this video, you'll love this next one.